Welcome to this walk through Philippians 2, verses 12 and 13. Paul has just rehearsed the amazing Christ hymn and shown us Christ's humility and God's exaltation of Christ, affirming what Christ has done. And now Paul spells out some of the implications of that vision for the life of Christians who share in this mind of Christ. So that's where we're at in the flow of Philippians. Our sentence begins, Hoste agapetoi mu. Now, hoste is often used with the infinitive to express result. But in this case, we don't have an infinitive going with hoste, but rather katergadziste, which here is going to be an imperative. And with the imperative, or an indicative or a subjunctive, hoste can function as a sentence connector, meaning therefore or for this reason. And you can check out Danker's Concise Lexicon or the other lexicons for that. Now, once we've worked through this sentence, then we'll come back and consider what the significance of this particular connector is. How is it connecting what follows with what preceded? Agapetoi looks like a nominative, and of course it could be, but in the plural, nominatives and vocatives share the same form. And here the commas help us recognize this as a vocative. So, therefore, or for this reason, my beloved. In modern translations say something like my dear friends or other things like that. So moving on, kathos pantate hypekusete. So kathos introduces a comparative clause. So before we get to our main verb that goes with hoste up here, we get an extended comparative clause introduced by kathos. The Philippians have already been acting in keeping with the exhortation Paul's going to express in this hoste clause. In other words, this kathos clause here is introduced before we get to the main verb of the hoste clause, modifying it. And so what Paul is going to say here with the katergadziste, the kathos shows us that what they've already been doing is comparable to that. Hypekusete here is an aorist, as you can see from the sigma alpha. And I'm going to take this as a summary aorist. In other words, expressing as a simple whole the idea of the verb. Here it's their consistent pattern of obedience. The summary aorist is often translated with a simple past tense in English, but sometimes the summary aorist includes activity right up to the present. And so in English we would signify that with a perfect tense. So here Paul says that they have always obeyed. Have always obeyed. See the have there in English. Right up to now. The noon down here shows us that it's right up to the present. So we can translate this just as you have always obeyed. Now this could be a reference to obedience to Paul's exhortations and guidance. The Philippians have already received and acted on Paul's directions, and so now he wants them to do so again with this exhortation he's about ready to give them. On the other hand, this obedience could refer to their obedience to God. Paul sometimes distinguishes commands of the Lord from his own thoughts on a matter, and 1 Corinthians 7 is one of the best examples of that. Here in verse 10, to the married I give this command, not I but the Lord. A wife is not to leave her husband. Referring back to the oral tradition that we now have in our Gospels regarding issues of divorce. Quoting this from the CSB, Christian Standard Bible. It used to be the Holman Christian Standard Bible. Now it's been revised in 2017, and it's just called the Christian Standard Bible now. And playing around with it a little bit, it's good. I'm enjoying working with it. And so verse 12 has a different take, but I, not the Lord, say to the rest. If any brother has an unbelieving wife and she's willing to live with him, must not divorce her. So Jesus didn't explicitly teach on that matter to Paul's knowledge, and neither to ours, since we don't have in the Gospels any record of that. So he says, I, but not the Lord. In other words, it's not that the Lord wouldn't agree with this, but he doesn't have it directly from Jesus, like he does this first one. And then finally 7:25, now about virgins, which I take to be a reference to unmarried daughters. I have no command from the Lord, but I do give an opinion as one who by the Lord's mercy is faithful. So Paul's able to distinguish how directly he is receiving this teaching from the Lord, but all of Paul's teachings meant as guidance in knowing and doing God's will. So ultimately, here in Philippians, we have a reference to obedience to God, even if it's also has in mind the directions given by Paul. So Paul is saying here, just as you have always obeyed the Lord, according to the guidance I've given you. Next, the kathos clause contains two units that I've separated out with parentheses. Me hos inte parousia mu monon, ala nun palomalan inte apousia mu. So we have a me ala construction, common construction signaling contrast. The form of contrast that we have here is the difference between two statements with neither of them being denied. So X, but also Y. They're obedient not only in my presence, but also in my absence, Paul's saying. So in using Enjoying Biblical Greek in a section listing several pages worth of these different labels that you can use as a shorthand way of summarizing your analysis of a passage, on page 213 I have some example of this kind of contrast. Now, for many people, contrast means something a little different, which I'm labeling negative positive, a relation which one item is affirmed and the other denied. Many people would think of contrast that way, not X but Y. I'm getting this use of this term from some of the resources that talk about such labels and such analysis. So I'm not sure this is the best thing, because intuitively contrast can mean more than one thing to different people. Anyway, that's what I'm working with, and you can see that this is the type of contrast we have here in this me ala. Not this, but also this. So in both cases they're obedient, both in his presence and his absence. And in fact, he emphasizes their obedience now in his absence. Palomalan. Palomalan, literally by much more. By much more. The dative here being a dative of measure, according to Wallace on page 166 of his Greek Grammar Beyond the Basics. Parousia and apousia, deriving ultimately from, as the participles from paremi and apemi, but they've become nouns, and you can look them up as nouns in the lexicons. Now, what's going on with this hos here? Not as in my presence only or alone, the accusative adverbial use of an adjective, but now by much more, or how much more, in my absence. You probably learned hos as a comparative, just like kathos here. Kathos is actually kata with hos combined, but hos all by itself, as. But in fact, hos is used in a great many ways. BDAG has 5 columns devoted to this little 2-letter word. And Montanari, in the larger lexicon, has over 8 columns of even smaller print than BDAG. So it's a very complex word, really. And the word as in English has a complexity to it as well. But here the sense of when makes good sense. It's BDAG number 8. So as in my presence would mean when I was with you. Now how does this me ala construction here fit in the context? You see, you've got the map listing 2 options. It could modify kathos pantata hupakusata, just as you always obeyed, not only as in my absence, presence, but also in absence. Or it could go back to, actually it goes forward to what's going to come later, because remember this whole section here is before the main verb. So it could either refer backwards to kathos pantata hupakusata or forward to katergadzista. Or it could be ambiguous. Just, could go either way. So here's some translations that take it in various ways. The NIV seems to have the ambiguous option. Therefore, my dear friends, as you've always obeyed, and then you've got the dash here, the M dash, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. So just leaves it ambiguous as to which one it's modifying. In some ways, that's probably the best solution because it's ambiguous in the Greek, except for one factor that I'll mention in a minute. It could modify what follows. Therefore, my dear friends, just as you have always obeyed, so now, not only in my presence, but even more in my absence, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Moving this so now to that position here in the CSB seems to indicate that it's going to modify what follows, the working out your salvation. Or it could modify what precedes, and the NASB may be taking that interpretation. Let's look at it. So then, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. And you see the way I read that, tend to put it back with what precedes, but in some ways the NSB could be taken with what follows too, so it may be more ambiguous. And in fact, as I've tried to figure out how to translate this to bring out that it's modifying what precedes, it's hard to do in English without getting fairly paraphrastic. So it may be best to leave this as ambiguous, but I think there's one little factor that may point to one of the particular solutions, and that's this word pantete. So if this section modifies kathos pantete hypokousete, then the point is that Paul is aware that they've remained faithful to God. Paul's presence helped them to be faithful while he was with them, but they've been able to remain faithful even while he's absent. And so that whole description of presence and absence and their obedience in both conditions then would be unpacking pantete. You've obeyed always, both in this condition and this condition. And that would match what he says at the outset of the letter in chapter 1, verse 5, that he's rejoicing in their partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. So that may point to Paul unpacking more of this pantete here. But it makes sense going in either direction, really. So the ambiguous option may be best. Now we move on to the next clause in our sentence, and it begins with a prepositional phrase, meta phobu kai tramu, tein hauton soterian katergadziste. And so this meta phobu kai tramu is a biblical expression, and it's used in a couple of ways. Hellerman has a nice summary of that in the EGGNT volume, page 130. And he notes that most references in the Septuagint use this expression of the reaction of Israel's enemies to God's mighty acts. So in other words, God acts in favor of Israel, and the enemies react in fear and trembling. Here in Philippians, however, it's used of the reaction of the Philippians. So it doesn't refer to fear in the sense of you better get this right, or you were on the losing team, or something like that, but rather awe. Almost all, I think all the commentaries recognize that, at least most of them. And the next verse, though, may well give the source of that awe. In other words, it's the very presence of God within us and among us. So the very reason for awe here, fear in that sense, is because the one working in you is God. So the presence of the Lord working for Israel struck fear into her enemies, but it was a source of joy for God's people. And there's one example of that use of the fear and trembling in the Septuagint. Here's Hellerman's description of that. The single Septuagint occurrence where Israel's response to God is in view paradoxically enjoins God's people to exult or rejoice in the context of fear and trembling. And then he cites Psalm 2:11, which the New English translation of the Septuagint renders, "Be subject to the Lord with fear and rejoice in him with trembling." So here in Philippians, the working out of salvation is with this sense of numinous awe as being in the presence of God and God within our very selves and amongst us as a community. And that's completely compatible, obviously, with a sense of joy. And that's a recurring theme in this letter, though it's not mentioned in this sentence. This prepositional phrase is probably modifying what follows. Tein hauton soterian katergadzesta. Katergadzesta from katergadzomai, middle preference verb, or deponent as some people refer to it. Neva Miller's list that I've mentioned to you before would have this as an example of the verbs of self-interest. In other words, the middle is preferred because there's this intensified reference to the self. Class 4, she says, are verbs occasionally show the subject acting in his own interest. She includes ergodzomai in that, and so probably katergodzomai works there as well. Now, looking at the 23 uses of this verb katergodzomai in the New Testament, most of them have the basic sense of either produce or do. And the idea of producing one's salvation seems to jar against the picture in the New Testament if we take salvation as referring to the act of saving, because clearly this is God's work of bringing life from the dead. For example, back in chapter 1, verse 6, Paul says, and this is again the CSB, he who started a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus. Now, most English translations here have work out, which seems to be a way of expressing the idea of do. Perhaps do your salvation means to live out your salvation. In other words, live according to its reality and its fullness and live into the fullness of it. And that would include Paul's earlier prayer for them that their love would keep on growing in knowledge and every kind of discernment in verse 1:10. 1:9. It would be another way of saying that what Paul has just said in 2:5, have this mind in you, which is also in Christ Jesus. So to have this mind is something they're supposed to do. They already share in the mind of Christ by their union with Christ, but they need to increasingly share in it and live according to it. And so in this way, salvation then wouldn't be the act of saving, but be a reference to the fruit of God's work, which is something that we participate in by His grace. So katergodzomai could refer to producing salvation in the sense of a life in alignment with God and His will. Now that's something God must do, and the next verse is going to emphasize that. But we also have a role to play, and we're not saved by works, but we're not saved without them either, in this sense. And this notion of becoming what you are is a hallmark of Paul's ethical teaching, the indicative preceding and enabling the imperative. Well, moving on to verse 13, the second part of our sentence, theos garesten. So we've got this nominative here with esten. And Wallace notes that grammatically the subject is not theos here, but this next nominative, ha energon in humin, on down through the rest of it here. So theos then would be the subject complement, or the predicate nominative, if you want to use that term. And it's moved up to the front for emphasis. You can see Wallace page 46 and 264 for those thoughts. Now, many English translations convey this emphasis by saying something like, it is God who works or is at work. The Net translation tries to follow the grammar more closely. What it has is, for the one bringing forth in you both the desire and the effort for the sake of His good pleasure is God. So that's following the Greek grammar very closely and yet still having a smooth translation. Now, energon comes from energeo, the same verb that's going to be used down here in the infinitive form, energein. Here in the participle, it has two direct objects, these two infinitives, ta thelling, kai ta energein. So this first use of energeo, it's transitive, which means to bring about, to work, to produce, to effect. That's the second meaning in Danker's Concise Lexicon. And what it produces is the willing and the working. And the infinitives then indicate what God produces. The second infinitive, or second use of energeo, doesn't have an object. And when this verb is intransitive, according to the first definition in CGEL, the concise Danker, it is to be vigorous in pursuit of an objective. In other words, to be active, to work, to operate. Now, what about this prepositional phrase? Well, hyper can convey the idea of cause, because of. And this is an option here, especially if the prepositional phrase modifies ha energon. Let's look at that in the map. So hyper tes eudokias could be modifying ha energon. So we'd have something like the one who brings about in you because of his good pleasure, both the willing and the working, is God. But hyper can also signal support or interest. Here's Danker's concise article on that. It's the first meaning for hyper, a marker of a stance of concern or interest relating to someone or something, or a metaphorical extension of the spatial sense over or above. So for, or in behalf of, or in the interest of. That's the sense that most English translations find here, and it works well whether the hyper phrase is modifying ha energon or the infinitives. So here we see the two options. Modifying energon, the one who brings about in you in interest of or for the sake of his good pleasure, both the willing and the working, is God. Or with the infinitives, the one who brings about in you both the willing and the working in behalf of his good pleasure is God. Now, most English translations take the final prepositional phrase as modifying the infinitives, in other words, door number 2 here. But some, like the New Jerusalem Bible, take it as modifying ha energon. NJB has for this section, it is God who, for his own generous purpose, gives you the intention and the powers to act. Notice that all these translations are taking tes here as a possessive. Remember that the definite article can serve as a possessive. So you can see Wallace, page 215 for that. So here, for his good pleasure. So taking the prepositional phrase with the infinitives fits with Paul's earlier statement at the outset of the letter. This is chapter 1, verses 9 through 11. And I pray this, that your love will keep on growing in knowledge and every kind of discernment, so that you may approve the things that are superior, and may be pure and blameless in the day of Christ, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ to the glory and praise of God. And again, using the CSB for that. So here, God's good pleasure here would be analogous to the things that are superior. And the salvation here in our verse in chapter 2 would be related to a state that is pure and blameless in the day of Christ. Now that we walked through this sentence, at least a little bit, some of the main points, let's go back and think about the significance of that first word, hosta, and how it's connecting our sentence with what came before. I said it was a sentence connector, meaning therefore, or something like that. Paul has said that his readers are to share in the mind of Christ, which has been shown to be characterized by humility and obedience. And so this vision of Christ, and the call to share in his very mind, then is a very powerful expression of both the indicative and the imperative. And it's in this light, then, that the obedience of discipleship follows. That's the therefore. Therefore, given this vision and this call to share in the mind of Christ, here's what that's going to look like. And that's what we'll see in the rest of the letter. So obedience is not just conformity to external rules. It's a sharing in the very mind of Christ. Elsewhere, Paul will emphasize the role of the Spirit and our keeping in step with the Spirit. Here we share in Christ's mind, and therefore we are to work out or live into or do our salvation with a sense of awe that it's God who is working in us to will and do his good pleasure.